With development pressures, climate change and declining space for connectivity across the Greater Sydney Basin and beyond, there is an increasing need for restorationists, plant producers, planners and landscape architects to collaborate on ensuring natives of the correct provenance and genetics are conserved as well as planted within urban spaces.
We've got Greg Steenbeeke up next. Greg is known to pretty much everyone in this room. He's been involved with various iterations of the environment type departments, but his area of expertise that he's really well known is certainly the Cumberland Plain. He's a real authority on that. So Greg's going to talk to us this morning about the Cumberland Plain Conservation Plan. Thanks, Greg.
Thanks, Paul. As Paul has said, there's an awful lot of familiar faces in this room, and in reality I'm hoping that I'm not telling you stuff you already know. Reiterating what we all work in and what we're all doing is part of why we're here, but it's also part of building a conservation plan that's going to be acceptable to everyone in the community, in the industry and in the environment in general. So what are we doing? We're looking at developing a biodiversity certification under the Act, under the Biodiversity Conservation Act, for the area that you can see there as the orange-toned landscapes. So working up from the south, we've got the Wilton growth area, the Greater Macarthur growth area, which goes from just south of Appin through to around about Glenfield. Then we've got the area around the Aerotropolis, which extends from just north of the existing growth centre, which is that purpley grey tone patch, and the airport itself, which is the new airport, which is the brown patch. And then north of the Aerotropolis, the northern side of the water pipelines, we've got the Greater Penrith to Eastern Creek Urban Investigation Area. As you know from these areas, they are highly variable in what's already there and what's available to be there. We're looking at, in the northern one, we're looking at a primarily urban landscape with scattered patches. In the south we start to find a little more intact vegetation, and certainly along South Creek. As we come further south we get to progressively more and more intact landscapes. The other thing that we're taking into account in the project are those orange lines. Those are the future transport corridors. In order that the government could manage the whole process of trying to get a single concept for what we're doing in Western Sydney, we're looking at a plan out to 2056. So we're looking at almost a 36-year plan by the time we get approval in 2020, hopefully, to look at how we roll out both the impact from development and the offset at a landscape scale. So what are we looking at? Well, as I said, the delivery period of the plan is to 2056. So we're not looking at a short-term plan. We're looking at something which over the next almost 40 years is going to determine whereabouts we're allowing for the impact to have been assessed, which is part of the biocertification. It identifies what the asset is that we're losing, but also too, what we can identify both within the growth areas and more broadly across that whole Cumberland Plain study area, which is the broad reddish outline there, which is roughly the boundary of the Cumberland subregion of the Ibra bioregion, excepting the area that's more urbanised to the east and the two growth centres which are already addressed. So we're looking at, within those areas, what do we have in the way of impacts and what are we going to be looking at in the way of identifying our losses and our gains through offsetting. We're looking at primarily identifying, if not only realistically identifying, our offsets and accepted offset, so the accepted gain for the loss due to development in reserves that are managed by National Parks and Wildlife. So they've got a permanent creation state, if you like, but also two biodiversity stewardships, which, because they're tied to title, because they have the credits that can only be sold once, can only be traded and retired once, they have a one-off use, if you like. They are the only ways we're accepting as securing our biodiversity offsets. And the reason we're doing that is because we want to ensure that we're not doing what has in the past happened, where you get a reserve that's managed by council, it ends up after 5 years, no longer being funded by the development contributions, and they look for another way to manage it. We're trying to resolve that by using biodiversity stewardships as a way of funding in perpetuity management of these sites. So what are we actually looking at? That's the southern half of the Cumberland subregion. Needless to say, as was mentioned before in Teen's talk, there's not a great deal of vegetation in an intact state left there. What that means is we're looking at not only managing what we can to retain the best patches, the things that are identified in the Cumberland Plain Recovery Plan as the priority conservation lands, in biomap as the lands that are connections as well as the priority areas, but also too we're looking at restoration and regeneration as parts of our project. So being strategic, it gives us the opportunity to work across the landscape. A strategic biocertification is only available to planning authorities, so that's the Department of Planning and Local Government. What it allows for are things other than just like for like in how the offset is delivered. What we can look at is identifying through planning instruments, through identified landscapes, what we want to have our regeneration placed into. And we get the best opportunities for restoration, maintaining connectivity, addressing climate change, migration and issues like that through this process. If it was done on a piece by piece, developer finds offset, secures offset, there isn't that strategic outcome because it becomes piecemeal across the landscape and you don't get that connectivity that we're aiming for. So how are we securing it? As I said, there's many facets and the full spectrum of what people in this room would consider both the starting condition and a process for regeneration and restoration is what we're looking at. We're not looking at everything is being delivered as full restoration. We're looking at the majority of our outcome is actually going to be amelioration and improvement of condition of patches that are in existence, connections that are in existence, bulking out edges. The plant community types that we're impacting are identified to be restored to benchmark now. There was already a comment from Ben about benchmarks. The benchmarks are established through the vegetation information system for each of the plant community types. Here's a screen grab from what you can see for the Shale Plains woodland, part of the Cumberland Plain woodlands community. This identifies each of the points at which that patch, a 20 by 20 quadrat for floristics within a 20 by 50 quadrat for structure and condition, is assessed. And how that patch matches to what the expected benchmarks are gives you that veg integrity score. So we're looking at, within this 849, there's there are condition states to meet benchmark of having 5 types of trees, 8 types of shrubs, 12 types of grass and grass-like plants, 15 types of forbs, 2 types of ferns, and 5 types of other. So those are 6 growth form groups that are identified in the legislation and through BAM. And within that, that's what we're targeting for diversity. The covers we accept, they're going to be more difficult to achieve, but if we can achieve at least the diversity within that 20 by 20, remember, then we're starting to get a good way towards what we're looking at as restoration. So the plan requires the management of sites to return the vegetation that is present to better condition. That is what generates the credits that are the units that we are changing and interchanging as part of the process. So you're looking at assessment of sites through BAM when you're getting a site identified as being a potential offset site, or as a reserve, also too putting it through BAM so we know what's at that reserve. The required management actions give you a little bit of hold or a bit of uplift if you're lucky, as Aslan was showing before, that general degradation, the required management activities are those that are basically intended to ameliorate or stop that general degradation. The active management actions, they're things that people in this room are involved with. That's things like adding additive planting, doing more intensive weed control, doing other factors and taking into account other actions that provide an active regeneration state. One of those things, of course, is fire. Problematic in Sydney? We'll see. The active management actions also lead to a greater credit yield. So if you're doing only the required management actions, you're probably only generating between 1 and 4 credits per hectare. If you're doing the active, you can generate up to 10 credits per hectare, depending on your starting state and depending on how much money you're willing to put into the process to actually kick the process along. The required landholder obligations are identified in Table 6 in BAM, and the active are in Table 7 in BAM. So I welcome you to go and look at those documents. They are on the Legislation New South Wales websites for BAM, and BAM itself is also undergoing a current review, so feel free to put in any commentary you want. You've got until the 16th of October. So, what are the restoration expectations of the Cumberland Plain Conservation Plan? Well, there's some of the options there. Are we looking at restoration by tree planting? Are we looking at the use of fire and natural regeneration as part of that? Are we looking at ameliorating planting by going into understories and adding species that are missing or short for our benchmark status? Or are we looking at managing regeneration? In actuality, we're looking at all of those options, and there's no reason we should be obscuring or neglecting any particular one of them. Fire can be difficult in small patches, yes, but there's no reason some of these reserves aren't going to be large and shouldn't be using fire. So the management actions that we're looking at need to be costed appropriately, as is required in BAM and identified in the Act. The actions have to be costed as though they're being undertaken by a third party, and there has to be sufficient opportunity in the cost of those credits to be able to ensure that as there's dynamism in those pricing components, the price of wire and steel has changed drastically because it's usually costed in US dollars. The costs of doing assessments of the seed quality and of obtaining enough seed are issues that we need to address properly. And there's no reason that as this process goes through, we can't identify a suitable credit price for what we expect to be the actions that are identified under each condition, starting condition, and each expected finish state of those landscapes. So what does the restoration for the plan actually look like? Well, as I said, it's only going to count towards the conservation plan when it has an in perpetuity status. So that is restoration that is undertaken and tied to the landscape and to the place in which it's occurring, and to a management action plan that is written for that place. It is potentially including a restoration planting, which is why we're here today. The narrow band of communities that we're impacting, things like plant community types, and I talk in these all the time, so excuse me if I'm talking in numbers that mean nothing to you, but 849 and 850 are the Cumberland Plain woodland communities, Shale Plains and Shale Hill woodlands. 1395 is Shale Sandstone Transition Forest. 724 is Cooks River Castlereagh Ironbark Forest, and 835 is River Flat Ute Forest. They are the 5 communities which, above all, we have a sizable impact upon. Within those communities, we have a lot of species in common. Now, as I said, what was mentioned before was some of these communities have themselves quite a variable array of species. So if we look at what the TOSA fidelity values, so the number of species in that community that are identified in the published works by Mark Tozer and others, we see there's 145 species in 849. There's 68 species in 850. So even the 2 variants of Cumberland Plain woodland have wildly different numbers of species that are identified as their fidelity. In 1395, we have 103 species. In the adjacent 1081, so that was once called the high quartz component or the Sydney hinterland transition woodland, we're looking at 193 species. The highest one in this part of the world is 1782, which has 239 species identified as having high fidelity to the community. So we can see these aren't species which by themselves are only found in this community. They are found across all of the communities. And as I showed before in the benchmark data, we actually aim to get a certain representation of species in each of the growth form groups. So just here in these photos, we have 4 of the growth form groups identified. We have the tree, obviously, in this case amplifolia. We have a shrub, so Cloanthus stocatus, and then we have the fern and the herb. So we have 4 different growth form groups identified there, and of those species would be identified into 2 or 3 different communities. They're not restricted to a single one. Growth form groups are the target of the diversity values for meeting BAM. And yes, it is simplistic to talk about it in that way, but there's no reason we can't look at the diversity within obtaining those growth form groups. For those that are unaware, each species that is native to New South Wales has also been assigned to a growth form group as part of a project that led into the data that backs up BAM. So what do these benchmarks look like? So here they are, a little more readably, for each of these communities. So you can see, for instance, just looking at the FORB component for Castlereagh 781, so that's coastal floodplain wetlands. We're looking at 5 different species of FORBs, 8 different species of FORBs in river flat Ute forest, 8 different species in swamp oak forest, 14 different species in moist shale hills woodland, 14 in Cumberland Plain woodland, 14 in shale sandstone transition forest, but those 14 are not necessarily all the same species. There'll be a lot of overlap. You'll look at finding them. And remembering too, these are not over the whole patch. This is just what you're expecting to see as a representation in a randomly selected 20 by 20 quadrat. So that leads us to the next point, which is, again, why we're here. Seed and seedling supply is going to be a serious part of this process. So we recognise that the draft plan is accepted. There's going to be issues with the supply. The diversity of material, the suppliers, the stage and state of supply. The plan, we hope, adds certainty to market because it's identifying that over the next 36 years we have to find a certain amount of offset, and that offset is going to require both restoration and reconstruction. And what opportunities limit those things. So in the future planning, we're looking at, essentially it's an indefinite management action into reserves and BSAs. What considerations do we need to take into account for climate change? Population genetics, and particularly with kangaroo grass, we're also looking at the ploidy, what connectivity we need and what supplementary needs are required on those lands that get planted out. There's opportunities for the wider community, and here we're looking at those that are able to supply the seeds into market. And all those factors that were mentioned in the earlier session, of course, come into play. So thank you for listening.